If you or someone you know is in immediate crisis or has suicide-related concerns, please call 1-833-456-4566 toll-free or visit talksuicide.ca. The number again is 1-833-456-4566 toll-free.
From Flourish DX, this is the Psych, Health and Safety Canada podcast, with workplace mental health becoming a priority for businesses who want to retain staff and prevent burnout. This is the source of information for creating sustainable and psychologically healthy workplaces in Canada.
Welcome, everyone, and welcome to the Psych, Health and Safety Canada podcast, and I'm your host, Kim MacDonald. Today, I'm very excited. Our guest is Seana Jewer. And Seana is a community engagement leader with the Mental Health Commission of Canada's Roots for Hope project. And she's going to share a lot more about that with us today, which is a suicide prevention project. And she works within the Nova Scotia Health Authority. And the interesting thing about Seana is she is very close from a grassroots community-based level. So I'm really interested to hear some of the research and her thinking around that and for workplaces. She has worked with the Canadian Mental Health Association and other not-for-profits. She has served on one of the region's health authority boards, community health boards. She has a master's in arts and education and a master's in business administration. And her undergraduate degree is in psychology and human resource management. So welcome, Seana, and thanks for being here.
Thanks, Kim.
So it is really great to see you. I know we've seen each other very recently, last week. But to give our listeners a sense of you, if you could share a little bit about your own personal and professional journey that brought you to do the work you do, and some of the experiences you have, and share so they can get a sense of who you are and your area of expertise.
Sure. Thanks, Kim. So as you mentioned, I've done a lot of work in communities. My career started in the nonprofit sector, and I was an executive director of a small nonprofit for many years, and then moved into a director of HR role when those organizations had merged together. And throughout that time, I think that was, good 25 years ago now when I first started a nonprofit, when mental health wasn't the conversation that it is today. And so when I reflect on my time in those leadership roles as an executive director, really understanding how mental health played into our work, but not really being cognizant of the time and thinking about how I could have done things differently in that. When I moved into an HR role in the nonprofit sector with that merger, as many of the listeners here I'm sure can appreciate, mergers are a stressful time for organizations, and mental health became even more of a forefront in my understanding of working with people and providing leadership in organizations. And also experiencing my own mental health during that time. I was a sole HR person in the throes of a merger. So, those kind of workplace conversations that you have when you're kind of have comrades, to be able to talk about things, but it wasn't there. And so often felt isolated, in my role in HR. And, so then, after about doing that for 5 years and kind of getting that merger underway and things in place, I took a little break and thought, I really, want to focus more on supporting people's mental health. And that's when I landed at the CMHA Nova Scotia. And there I got the suicide prevention portfolio, which began my career about almost 4 years ago now in the work of suicide prevention. And as you mentioned, my background is not as a clinician or as a social worker, but it is very much of understanding how communities prevent suicide and what work we can do and legitimately do to help protect people and give hope to others.
It's an interesting conversation in the workplace, the topics that you're bringing with the Roots of Hope and other areas of your work. And from this podcast is around psychological health and safety, mental health at work, and the influences, contributors, and really trying to encourage people to become more curious about the workplace experience. From your perspective, how would you define psychological safety or psychological health and safety at work?
Yeah, it's a, very big topic. There's lots of things to consider, but I think at the root of it is being mindful of people and how People do bring their whole selves to the workplace. And so I think initially, when we think of workplace psychological health and safety, we might think of just the factors that in the environments that we're creating and the relationships we're creating within work. But we also have come as people, and so we have our personal lives that are also attached to that. And so being mindful that we never really truly know what someone's going through, and the way we treat each other and the relationships we build, and how we can support each other through, I think is key in creating those workplaces that are psychologically health and safe.
To give our listeners a sense of the challenge and some of the degree of whether it's roots of hope or just some of the statistics in Canada, if you could share a little bit about it and give us some context for suicide and rates of suicide and other, I guess, pieces of content that you think might help give people a sense of the nature of suicide in Canada and deaths by suicide.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm not sure, Kim, if it's just because this is the space that I work in and because people know that, people share lots of conversations with me around it, but it doesn't seems that everyone has been touched in some way by suicide, whether, directly or know somebody who has contemplated or has died by suicide. But in Canada, about 4,500 people die by suicide each year. And about 78% of those deaths occur with people who would be considered working age adults. So say between the ages of 30 and 64. And approximately about 200 people attempt suicide each day. And there's lots of people who will have suicidal ideation. And that's not a number that's really concrete, but, these are passing thoughts of hopelessness and, wanting a way out. So it is it's a significant factor in Canada for sure, and one that needs proper attention.
In workplaces, so I'm very familiar with mental health awareness and training in workplaces, and also the programs around suicide prevention. But in those sort of more standard mental health awareness and training for employees at work, suicide prevention or suicide conversations are a smaller part of that, and not, they don't really go into it in depth. So maybe you can share a little bit. You're probably more familiar with that from the Mental Health Commission of Canada's perspective too.
I think in part it depends on the type of work that people are doing, so for work that's related where, employees are going to be experiencing a lot of traumatic events, so I'm thinking of first responders and police and that sort of thing. Suicide prevention work is probably a little bit more on the forefront. In some of our corporate spaces, maybe not so much. And even having mental health literacy in the workplace is still relatively new. So suicide is a space where, it is the, people perceive it as the more extreme, and associate a lot with mental illness and that sort of thing. So finding people's place in understanding how suicide is, there's a continuum of it as well. But people do need to start with mental health literacy first. So I think, it's going to be that progression where more organizations will be able to understand their role with preventing suicide. And we're just at a place right now where we're really focusing on building mental health literacy in general and reducing some of the stereotypes in that space first. And then as people get more comfortable with that, I think suicide is could be something that people lean into a little bit more.
That's what I believe too. There's so much talk and conversation around mental health that I think for sometimes we get I think there is the understanding that there's a lot more happening and going on than perhaps there is. And maybe it's just the level and depth of the conversation. So from the work that you've been doing, it's great to hear from your perspective too, Seana, that you also think we're still in very much the early days of mental health literacy, and then trying to move into more, I guess, more complex challenges. So for the topic of suicide and understanding that suicide, there's a lot of complexity around that. Maybe just share a little bit about that itself. And what do we know about it? And what do we, from a workplace leader, if you're thinking of a health-oriented leader in a workplace, what do we know and what could we know or explore or get more curious about at work?
So I think as far as what do we need to know about suicide prevention piece, I think that there are you could simplify it and say that there's the kind of three key areas that you might look at it from a leadership point of view. There's the prevention, intervention, and the postvention. So the prevention is all the work we do while people are maybe having thoughts of suicide or suicide ideation, but they're not, there's no plan thought of, there's no, the thoughts may be passing and this sort of thing like that. But we're trying to create really healthy environments and healthy relationships to support people, and looking at some of those protective factors like reducing isolation, increasing sense of belonging, financial security, and these pieces. When we look at the intervention work, that's where, a lot of people kind of, when they think of community suicide prevention or workplace suicide prevention, they may think, well, this is where I need to know who in my organization is thinking and having those conversations, right? So when we were talking about the intervention piece there, we want folks to be able to feel comfortable having the conversation around suicide, asking about suicide, and knowing where to go for resources and supports. And then postvention is when we've lost someone to suicide. Mm-hmm. And how does an organization then respond to that piece? And often that can be once the actual incident has happened. And it's a very difficult place, as anyone who's experienced any type of crisis management. If you don't have a plan in place before the crisis happens, then planning during crisis and implementing during crisis is super challenging. So I would say those three areas are really important. When thinking about the complexity of suicide, so many people are impacted. There is, anyone can have suicidal thoughts. And so there's many different people who experience it. There's not necessarily one particular type of person or, occupation or anything like that. So that adds the complexity to it. And so there's many different factors that lean into why somebody might have suicidal thoughts, which is why it's really important to have the conversations, because sometimes the solution or the way forward is through those conversations and understanding what is leading to the suicidal thoughts, and what we can do to help support that person find hope and get past them.
The stigma, I guess, around death by suicide, maybe share a little bit about that, because I in many cases, we would never know. I think the idea that the suicide numbers are actually probably lower than they actually are, because in some cases maybe they're not reported as a suicide. So our reporting numbers, but the stigma and therefore that's sort of attached to that stigma about how a person dies. Can you share a little bit about that and what we know about stigma and what does it do, or what's its impact on this topic?
Yeah. Well, I think stigma around suicide, it's that inability for people to be able to be completely honest and open about what's going on with them and express what they're thinking. And that stigma comes from a variety of places, because there's a huge risk that people take when they do, or it can be a huge risk when people share that they have suicidal thoughts. So there's a perception that somebody with suicidal thoughts is going to not be strong, not be able to handle things, that they are now, we sometimes infantile that person, treat them like a child, start taking away decisions and power and agency with that person. And so there's this idea that they're maybe mentally ill, and not everybody who has suicidal thoughts has a mental illness, and so there's a lot of things that are attached to that idea. It can break down communications with folks, because if someone discloses that they're having suicidal thoughts, now suddenly we don't know how to have a conversation with that person anymore. We have to, they become more delicate to us, and that's not helpful at the end of the day, right?
Just to go back a little bit to some of the myths around suicide, that a person who is thinking of suicide makes an attempt or does die by suicide, that it is very much associated with mental illness. Maybe share a little bit about that, because I think when you say that they aren't necessarily happening together, then maybe help people understand that a little bit, because I think there may be some perceptions around that it is, that they're very closely related.
Right. Yeah. And so I'll share my kind of understanding of that. So when someone does have a mental illness, so a mental illness being that they have a diagnosis that, what they're experiencing, is causing them not to be able to contribute and be productive and, have a fulfilling life, and that, so when we're talking like depression or anxiety or bipolar, schizophrenia, whatever it might be, when we have those diagnosed mental illnesses, then typically there's a treatment that comes in place, some sort of intervention in that, and that's a process to get through. So in some cases, people have been living undiagnosed, and that can be a very challenging place to be because you're trying to work through and support yourself through this mental illness without a diagnosis. Then there's no supports for what that looks like. And then once you do get diagnosed, then you also have to go through the process of working through what it looks like. So people may be prescribed a medication, and it doesn't work automatically. It takes time for your body and your mind to adjust to that medication. Sometimes it's not quite the right medication. And that is a very struggling time for folks. And that's where suicidal thoughts can come into play, because people have been dealing with this for a long time. When suicidal thoughts are not directly, or don't need to be connected to mental illness either, so you can have suicidal thoughts and not have a diagnosed mental illness. And that can come from major transitions in life, so people who are transitioning from being full-time work, and their identity is completely wrapped up into their work, and now they're retired and they don't have a sense of purpose anymore. It can come from transitions of, a woman becoming a mother and experiencing postpartum depression, so there's different things that can happen in people's lives that can cause people to lose hope and just feel very overwhelmed and, lose the will to live.
I think the understanding for workplaces about those big changes and about those times of transition, and that different times in our lives, we're at higher risk. So maybe there's an opportunity there for workplace leaders who really want to be health-oriented leaders and want to create psychological safety so that people will share. Obviously, leaders are not clinicians. However, when there are these circumstances, that this is a safe place for us to have conversations of mental health and other elements of struggle in your life. The postpartum and are there other times in transitions of change that we also could be more mindful of, that have and put us at higher risk?
So like any time that there's a large transition in a person's life could potentially be at risk. And of course, that doesn't mean that everybody is at risk for that, but it's just going to be mindful of those times. So we mentioned, women who may be experiencing postpartum. There's members of our 2S LGBTQI plus community that if they're going through transition, so if they're transitioning, then that could be a major event. Changes in careers and shifting careers, in workplaces where if there's been a workplace injury and someone has to shift the type of work that they're doing, that's a huge thing. And again, not everybody's going to experience suicidal thoughts when these things happen, but this is where it's more important to have a conversation and kind of make note of when things are kind of shifting and changing, and you notice that someone's not quite acting or behaving the same way that they normally do, and then being able to ask that question.
How would someone start a team conversation when the organization is going to go through a big change that is going to impact a lot of people in the workplace?
My thoughts are kind of around, hopefully there's been some work done before the organizational change is happening. Like, I wouldn't suggest bringing in the conversation around suicide because there's a change in the organization. Yeah, absolutely. There's many things that will happen, and people may not feel suicidal. So I think it's when you're experiencing a change in the workplace, being mindful of your team and everybody on your team and what they might be experiencing, and then looking out for folks and seeing how they're doing and checking in on them and that sort of thing. But, I guess that idea of when there is more open conversation and it's part of the workplace culture to have conversations around mental health and around suicide, I think education is a great place to start, because it creates some neutrality around it, right? You're not addressing incidences, you're just bringing the knowledge into the organization, and it becomes part of the conversations people can have and feel that they're able to have those conversations and that. So starting off in those places. So I would suggest, initially starting out with some mental health education, some, workshops or webinars, that type of thing, having some literature for employees to have. And then when talking specifically about suicide, we mentioned like the prevention, intervention and postvention spaces, right? And, it makes sense for people to start at an intervention space because I think that that's what people closely connect with, is like, I want to know what happens or what I should do when I know that somebody is having suicidal thoughts, or I want to be able to have that question if I need to, or ask that question if I need to, and that. So there's lots of different training programs that are out there to start that conversation with. And begin it with that. I think this is.
Can you give some examples? I know you're familiar with they're the ones that I'm familiar with, which is Assist and Safe Talk. Maybe share a little bit about those programs. And I have taken Assist myself, and it was an incredible experience for me, as well as the opportunity really did eliminate a lot of myths and ideas that I didn't think I even held about it, but it helped to deconstruct and get really curious about that for myself when I took it. And it's a pretty intensive program, even though it is, it's 2 full days, but it feels bigger than 2 days when you're in there. And I just wanted to, if you could share a little bit about those programs for as resources, or as for workplaces that are having bigger conversations around mental health, that these are part of that sort of the spectrum of literacy that they can start to explore. Share a little bit about those programs for those who don't aren't familiar.
And Kim, I love how you mentioned just around, some of the really good training programs will help people explore their understandings of suicide and their underlying beliefs, because that does influence the way we talk about suicide and the conversations that we are willing to have with folks and that. So yeah, and there's lots of different resources out there. So the Mental Health Commission of Canada and the Centre for Suicide Prevention, which is based out of Alberta, have tons of resources on their websites around suicide prevention. Safe Talk and Assist are 2 programs offered through LivingWorks. They're probably the best known, well-known programs. They are internationally recognized, and there's lots of research behind those programs. Safe Talk is a 4-hour workshop, and it helps people understand some of the warning signs around suicide, so when they're like, around people, they might pick up on some things that, which then prompts them to ask the question, are you thinking about suicide? And how it kind of helps you just get your head around how to say that, how to put those words out there, how to frame that for folks. And then, that training kind of leaves off with understanding the resources to help navigate to people too. The Assist program kind of builds on that piece of it by going further and asking people about suicide, but then also following up around what are some of those turning points that someone has? So when where Safe Talk kind of ends the conversation with, okay, I understand now that you're having suicidal thoughts. Let's find you some supports and resources. Assist kind of goes to the next step, which says, okay, you're having suicidal thoughts. Let's talk, right? And let's try to see what's keeping you here right now. What are some of those turning points, those pieces where you're feeling a little bit of hope, right? And so Assist is really meant for like that intervention piece, someone who is thinking about suicide a lot may have an action plan in place. They know how they would try to die by suicide and this type of thing like that. And it's bringing that person down to a place where they can acknowledge that they want to keep safe for now. And that's really the objective. So it's not to, you're not going to get rid of the suicidal thoughts in that conversation, but you're going to be able to help people keep safe for now, and then again, navigate them to more supports or resources that they might need. And those are 2 important pieces, around being able to ask the question and understand the resources that are out there. And then there's, that's like a piece of the puzzle there. And then the other pieces that I mentioned around the prevention work help kind of wrap around, some of those pieces. So the more that we understand kind of what brings someone to suicidal thoughts, that, there may be things that we can do to accommodate in the workplace or make changes and that will help people navigate on their healing journey.
That's amazing. Interestingly, the Canadian Association for Suicide Prevention, until a few years ago, I wasn't familiar with it. And, the role and the work that it does, and that it has a national Canadian conference every year, and brings in researchers who are continuing to explore and test all of the programs, ideas, and, thinking around those topics. So the evidence-based component of this topic is really, really important. One of the myths, maybe it's just breaking down some of those myths that we hold that from the research we know are there, which is, there's one that is around if you ask someone if they are thinking about dying by suicide, that might actually impact them and, not encourage them, but it might have an impact on whether they make that choice or not. So I think that is one of the bigger ones that I've heard in conversations. What can you share a little bit about that, about some of the myths, I guess, that we hold around the idea of suicide?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's a very common myth that if you speak the word, that suddenly it'll come true. And those that have suicidal thoughts already had them, whether you ask about them or not. And so if you're feeling like that is something that they may be thinking, often, another myth is that people don't give warning signs. And I'm not to say that everybody does give warning signs or that the warning signs are apparent, but the more kind of in tuned you are, then the more you're likely to pick up on it. And then asking about suicide is not going to cause them to feel those feelings stronger. It'll just open up that conversation to understand where they're at with it. And we know that the sooner that someone is able to share their thoughts about suicide and that, we can address that and that they can get help, the easier the healing road is, so when we catch suicidal thoughts very early, where they're just passing ideations and that, it's much easier to help and support than when somebody has been living with those thoughts and not sharing them and just have had those internal dialogues. Into a point where, it's much more serious thinking than when it initially began. So the sooner people are able to share, the better that is.
Inside workplaces, who can, I guess, be responsible for encouraging some of this literacy inside an organization? Where have you seen, in the mental health literacy and, along as well as literacy around suicide prevention? Where have you seen the best success inside an organization to, to start that literacy, I guess, pathway? Or how can you initiate that conversation? And who inside the organization is best equipped to lead it?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that's a question that whether it's in an organization or within community of who should be owning this work and who's responsible for this. And I guess my thoughts are really about breaking down that idea that this work, it needs to be owned by a certain person and that you have to have a certain background criteria in order to be able to contribute in some way. So we all have a role to play, and we're not all going to play the same role in someone's healing journey and helping support somebody with suicidal thoughts. But the people that are most likely to know if somebody is suicidal are maybe the people that are closest to that person. So if we look at it from an organizational perspective, say you have like a director of HR or an HR person, and you may say, well, that's the person who should be managing it. They may not be the person has that relationship with that employee. The relationship is the key right, in having those conversations, right? So if, in an organization, if a colleague, a coworker knows that somebody has suicidal thoughts, it's important that no one person holds that and is completely responsible for, helping support that person, that with consent, obviously, and helping with the idea that, we're going to create a circle of people to help support this person through. But that initial touch point is often somebody who's just close to that person and can hold that space, be compassionate, be understanding, and in some cases not have a fix-it hat on, right? Which sometimes when we're in leadership positions, we like to fix
I
stuff
love that.
and we like to fix it
No
fast,
fix-it hat.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. We want to have some real conversation and just be able to sit with that and, and understand where that person's coming from and then where they want to go with it. Right. So, really important. I think that, if a colleague is aware of someone else's suicidal thoughts that, I mentioned how we can sometimes infantilize that person, take away their decision-making power and that sort of thing. So always with consent, talking to that person, wow, you share something really important. This is really, you mean a lot to me. I want you to be well. Who else can we bring into this conversation that you think would support? Because maybe the HR manager is not the person that they want to help support them. Maybe it is detrimental to them because the workplace can also be, that place where people are finding some solitude, and it might be that place where there's routine in place. It's the financial stability. It's, the things that are causing them to feel hopeless are not necessarily connected to work at all, right? So anybody in the workplace could be informed on how to have those conversations, how to create that space for people to feel safe in sharing that they're having suicidal thoughts and understanding the resources that are out there to help support. Some of those resources could be internal to the organization, so an EAP program may be a great resource for somebody. Some of those resources could be outside of the organization, but allowing the person with suicidal thoughts to help navigate which path they want to take is really important. And then if there's an HR team, a person, or a, management team of some sort, understanding, okay, what do we need to have in place for folks, to help them through, and so what kind of accommodations might be needed, it may not come across as suicidal thoughts, but maybe just experiencing depression and that type of thing, so they may not label it as suicidality, but, label in other ways. And those same practices that we do for accommodation around other mental health issues are just as meaningful when someone is experiencing suicidal thought.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all Flourish DX Academy courses included within the Flourish DX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with Flourish DX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode.
I think the process of the prevention, the intervention, and then post-vention are important components of that. But the case for literacy in a broader way inside the organization, and perhaps not only in those key groups like HR or with managers to have a broader understanding, so you can create this culture, and it's the way you can safely work with others. You say that the explicit expression of suicide may not be the words or that are expressed, but there are other ways of describing it. Maybe it's that hopelessness, or as you say, it may show up as depression, or there's other things there that it isn't always this, those explicit words or those explicit things that someone's going to share. They're going to share maybe some other ways of communicating, different ways of feeling, and it may never show up as that word.
I think it's important that when we're having the conversation, and if we are feeling that someone is having suicidal thoughts, to be able to openly ask the question, are you thinking about suicide? how that plays out moving forward may not have that label attached to it. I think that there's still too much stigma in many of our workplaces to really articulate it to that extent. As similar, like what's coming to mind for me, Kim, is like when somebody is experiencing poor mental health or has a mental illness and is going into a job interview, right? That's huge risk to be disclosing that in a job interview and, thinking that people are going to be okay with that and manage that, right? We're just not there yet in our workplaces to be able to do that. So if someone in the workplace has disclosed that they're feeling suicidal thoughts, that if you have been given that information, that's really special, because that person took a huge risk in sharing that with you. And so how we treat that moving forward is really important, and honoring the fact that we live in a very stigmatized society right now. Workplaces may or may not, and depending on what work the workplace has done around suicide education, will depend on how it's going to be received. So if you're in an organization where there's been very little done, right, then it may not sound like suicide, right? And there may be accommodations and needs, navigating through, right? And helping through that, right? To, what's going on. And again, no one should keep that to themselves, in the sense that you're the one, if you disclose to me and I know that about you, right? That now I'm responsible for everything that happens to you, like that, we have to get a little bit away from those savior mentalities. And so there should be a team in place, again, with the consent of that person, and, not necessarily disclosing those words, like that. It's still up to that person to disclose themselves.
Okay. The privacy and confidentiality question too, Seana,
I think that's important.
How would you?
Yeah, it's that person's experience, right? It's not for me to share with others, right? But if they've shared with me, then I, play a role in helping navigate for supports and resources and that sort of thing. Asking, can we bring other people into this conversation? And what are we going to do to help, move forward to keep you safe? And then allowing that person to disclose what they want to disclose about their situation.
The emphasis on consent is really important for so many reasons. As I'm listening to you and I'm hearing it, and I can see how that, even in the post-vention conversation, can be reassuring for an individual who's gone through a very difficult time, and know that your privacy and confidentiality has been respected within the organization. And, we would hope that the organization experiences of mental challenges in our lives and up into, ideation would be respected, and it wouldn't impact how our colleagues view us. But as you say, it's still a risk, and we still have a stigmatized society. So for workplaces trying to figure out how to do that, what gives you hope for, and maybe you could share a little bit about Roots of Hope as an initiative. So what gives you hope as you work inside this work?
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So Roots of Hope is, as you mentioned, through the Mental Health Commission of Canada. So Nova Scotia Health has taken it on as a project, currently being mostly piloted in the Northern Zone, although I find myself in other areas of the province as well. And it's really about building capacity in community to support those that are contemplating suicide and or grieving from suicide. So a lot of it is, around how do we hold those spaces for folks to be able to have the conversation, understand their experiences, and help them in a variety of different ways, right? I work with a lot of folks with lived experience, so either those that have contemplated in the past and are on their healing journeys, or some who are still contemplating, and those that have lost to suicide. And so in those conversations, those are the folks that are very comfortable talking about suicide because they've experienced. And I think that's what we find in a lot of our workplaces too. Some of our most progressive, strongest leadership in mental health are from leaders who also have experienced either their own mental health issues or family, friends. There's a personal connect that they understand, this is not a sign of weakness. This is not, people not being resilient enough, that we all are vulnerable to different mental health issues throughout our lifetimes. So, I guess what gives me hope is around talking to these folks. I hear lots of stories of recovery, lots of people's journeys that have been both with clinical and therapeutic supports and people who have done it without it, right? And they talk about what's gone on in their lives that were really pivotal moments that changed their trajectories. So things like finding a job, getting a new place to work, someone who, finding relationships, finding secure housing, all of these things, like where, there are things that are outside of that clinical space that do impact people. And largely the thing I hear is around giving people purpose, right? So people who have just lost their purpose in life or felt that there was no reason for them to be in this world, right? And then someone gave them a reason, right? And that can come through work, right? For some, that is like, finding that, someone giving them a chance and employing them to do work, as giving them purpose, So that's, I think that there's a lot of ways that we can help from a community perspective, because purpose doesn't come in a clinician's office per se, right? Whether we, whole clinical space or whether we're a family member, a friend, a coworker, a manager. When we lose someone to suicide, we all feel we didn't do enough, right? And all we can do is what we can do our best in, right? So getting educated, building understanding, trying to hold that space, we're not going to cause harm, right? But we can, we can do the best that we can. And the more we understand and the more we are comfortable holding that space, then the more that we are doing, right? So it is scary when we know, when it's confirmed, because many of us will have that thought, like, I know they're not doing well, but I don't want to ask. I don't really want to know. And when we lose that person, it's hard. It's hard living through that, and coming to terms that I didn't quite do enough. And the more we know and the more we do, the more we can feel that I've done as best as I could in this situation, because it is super complex. Not one person is going to have the answer, but I feel like together, the stronger that circle of support is for that person in all different spaces. The clinical therapeutic space is very important or can be very important, as well as family and friends and coworkers in the workplace. Collaboratively, it's a circle of support around that person that lets that person know you are important to us and we want you to be here and we're going to see you through this journey together, right? In all of our own little spaces in whatever way we can.
For workplaces and some of the risk factors that are inherent in workplaces, just before we sort of move through that, I wonder if you could share some of the ones from the research that are some of the most difficult ones for people's mental health and work-related stressors, some of the things that show up at work.
Yeah, so the workplaces where people may experience suicidal thoughts more than others are in places where there could be easy access to lethal means, right? Okay. So if in your workplace there's like guns, like pesticides, that type of thing, or exposure to different chemicals and that can cause mood or behavior impairments. Highly stressful workplaces, so workplaces where people will experience traumatic events or really dangerous working conditions can be where we might see higher suicide rates. Any professions where there's a job insecurity, contract work, entrepreneurs, that type of thing, the risk is higher. Professions that have lower wages attached to them. There's sometimes, if there's like stressors in the workplace around things around inequity, so gender imbalances, homophobia, racism, this type of thing. Some workplaces are more challenged with those things, and those can increase suicidal thoughts. Inconsistent work schedules that cause disruption to family routines or inconsistent sleep patterns and that. And being isolated at work. So in some areas, like we have, there's not a lot of human contact with other people. You're working very siloed and on your own. So all of those kind of workplace situations may have, higher thoughts of suicide.
Thanks for that, because I think those are issues and challenges for workplaces and leaders to be, and the case for having a psychological health health and safety planning and strategy in place and really managing those risk factors and harassment and bullying and those kinds of, behaviors at work as well. Those are, the higher risk factors for workplace cultures that are having challenges for interpersonal conflict and all of the things around safety, psychosocial safety and physical safety. And those are also part of that psychological health and safety leadership and looking at them in a prevention and or what are the interventions that can change some of those conditions. So looking at the work conditions, I appreciate that. The isolation component too is one that there's a lot of really good information around that. And that's one that we haven't really addressed a lot. And certainly now we have a lot more variation. We certainly have occupations that work in isolation and certain sectors like construction and other heavy trades-based workplaces have a lot of that independent isolation. So those are all the risk factors, I guess, to be considering as you shared.
Yeah, and I think what's challenging in workplaces is the work is the work, right? So sometimes you can. There's only so much you can do to change the work environment. It is the type of work. So if you're in manufacturing and you've got night shifts, and however the work schedule is laid out and that sort of thing may be not as conducive, and may not to like a work-life balance and that sort of thing. But I guess so. I'm all about working reality. So that's kind of the reality that this is how the production works. What can we do to counteract that? So we're not going to change that. Sometimes we can't change the reality, but what can we do to counteract that so that person is able to get what they need, and that's where talking to the employees and understanding. So, when we talk about life purpose, if your job is to go work a night shift at a manufacturing plant day in, day out, and you've lost all connection to family and friends, you're not available for social events, your purpose in life is to do whatever you're doing at that plant. And, that does for some, it's not going to feel like a whole lot of purpose, right? We weren't put on this earth necessarily to do that, right? But these jobs also can pay very well, right? And there's a lot of security in these jobs. And some of these jobs are in very rural parts of our province, right? So these are realities, right? So being mindful about suicide, having conversations, creating those spaces for employees to talk, knowing the resources that are out there, having supports in place, like all of those should be responsibilities that the workplace takes on when they can't change the actual nature of the work.
Yes, you're talking about the protective factors. So what are the counterbalancing protective factors when you can't mitigate the risk because of the inherent nature of the job itself, that some of those job realities. So counterbalancing with protective factors, which around learning, education, supervisors going the extra mile to help employees understand how important their work is to the organization. Any final advice or any thoughts or ideas and anything you want to share on Roots of Hope or other things that you're working on, and advice for organizations and workplaces?
Oh, geez. Let's see. I think a large part of my work with Roots of Hope is just really building that narrative that we all have a role to play in suicide prevention work. I think that we've been kind of taught to think that, when it comes to suicide, that requires only clinical supports, that only people with a certain level of knowledge, a certain background in education can hold those spaces for folks. And so a lot of my work is really around, how do we create, those spaces that people can share their thoughts, share what they're experiencing, help support each other and hold those spaces. A lot of around understanding how are people currently doing that. So for those that have family and friends who have suicidal thoughts, they're doing it already. They are holding space for those folks every day. They do not go to the hospital every day. They're not visiting Emerge every day. That these are thoughts that people have, and we need to be able to know just how to hold that space, right? So So I still, lots of people still wanting there to be certain persons or certain professions or certain spaces where people go to, and it's really trying to expand that out so that people can understand what role they can play in their own space with that. And which is so important, as we're heading out of this next phase of COVID, whatever this is that we're in right now. And, people have, been through a lot, and, people are holding a lot right now. And so, just equipping people with the right tools and resources, so that people who are holding those spaces don't feel so alone doing it. Because even when you're doing it, you may be doing it. And there's so many amazing people out there that are truly keeping our people alive every day. They're also doing it largely alone because it's hard to share that with others, that this is the space that I hold from my partner or from my child or from my youth or from my coworkers. So, because of the stigma that's attached to it. So that's a lot of what my work is about with that. And that can seem very confusing. I guess it's not. I don't come with a program or a particular initiative. It's really meeting people where they're at with what they need. So, I would just really encourage people listening to just take some time to understand and learn a little bit more. Find your space in this conversation. What are you comfortable doing? What do you feel that you can do at this moment? And just build on that, because the comfort level will come. No one says that all HR managers need to be assist trained, right? For example, right? That's a way you could do it, but maybe not all want to hold that space, and that's okay too. But it's an individual journey too, around being comfortable, like you mentioned, Kim, around just your own thoughts around suicidality and how you believe, the values you put behind that, exploring that, and then what can I do? What am I comfortable doing? And what should I be doing moving forward that feels right? And then that'll help open up the space for a lot of more people. I think what's important when we're looking at community suicide prevention or workplace suicide prevention, though, Kim, is there's numbers attached to all different types of populations and that sort of thing. And there's many more people who will have suicidal ideation or contemplate suicide who will not die, but they live with that, right? So not everybody who has ideation or contemplation will die. Many more will think about it, and not as many will do it, right? So sometimes our energy can really be focused on who is dying and how do we prevent those deaths, right? And from a community or workplace perspective, my thinking is it sits more in clinician space, right? In some ways, right? But we can hold more space for those that are in those early ideation phases or contemplating. And the struggling, it's the day-to-day struggle and that sort of thing. So these are folks that, we can hold that space. And so as important as it is to understand the suicide statistics around death, there are many more that we don't really have actually a good number on, right? And it's a very diverse group of people. So it's really just more, in my mind, more important to be able to have a conversation and be able to understand where people are coming from, right? Because many people will perhaps be thinking and go through their own healing journey without ever disclosing. And it's just a lonely place to be, right? How can we make it more supportive, more inclusive, and more open, right?
Thank you for that, Seana. That is such an important message around this, because we can, and myself included, get into the numbers and trying to understand the numbers as a way in to figuring out how can I help, or where is my place in that. But the breadth of the experiences is much bigger than those numbers. So much bigger than those numbers. So thank you for those comments. That is really, really helpful to help reposition the way we can look at this. And
you're not going to see many people in the numbers. You're not going to see really good numbers about the 2S LGBTQI plus community or women survivors or, many groups, newcomers, many groups are not going to be identified in the numbers, right? And so the numbers tell you part of the story, and then but the context will be missing there. So we do know that men are more likely to complete But that doesn't mean that all of our energy is focused on just reducing men's suicide, right? Because those that are contemplating also need support as well. And because that's not how we want to live our lives, right? The hope comes from, especially when we're looking at different populations, right? Who understands postpartum and suicidality more than another woman who's experienced it, right? Or transitioning if you're a member of the 2SLBjoy Plus community, right? It's meeting others who have also thought these deep thoughts and these darker places, and they're still with us, and they managed through it. They worked through it. That is truly inspirational for folks, and that it validates their feelings, it normalizes the feeling, and it gives hope that I will not feel this forever, right? And those healing journeys are very diverse, some with clinical therapeutic supports, some with spiritual supports and interventions, some with, just the kindness of other people is what got them through. So it's, connecting to the people and their experience is huge, and just normalizing that, what you're going through is really rough, and it completely makes sense that you're done with this and you want it to end. And I've been there. This is my journey. Let me share this with you, and then support each other through it.
Yeah,
it's huge.
That's very hopeful. So thank you for all that you've shared, and for our listeners. If people want to reach out to you, how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah. So, so I am on LinkedIn, so you can find me on LinkedIn for sure. My email is Seana, Seana .Jewer, Jewer at nshealth.ca. You can find me either way, that way.
Yes.
Google my name.
I know.
It probably
it
will
is
come up somewhere.
a unique number.
Sure.
It is a unique name, so it's going to be a little easier to find you, which is good. So thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you, everyone, for listening in wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can always reach out to me on LinkedIn as well, or at 13factors.ca. And always interested in hearing your thoughts, ideas for podcasts around psychological health and safety in the workplace and mental health at work, and different topics. Always looking for guests as well. So please reach out to me, and thank you for spending your time with us. And hopefully, if you're at the Psych Health and Safety Canada website, check out other episodes as well, and help us with our reach. So share them with colleagues, friends, and other people in your network, and help us share the information around psychological health and safety. Thank you very much, and until next time.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in North America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.